well met. I am your humble bard Amanda, here to share with you tales of daring do and daring don't, in the hopes of entertaining, amusing, perhaps even educating, and all I ask in return is that you stay a while and listen. There's no such thing as a Scottish dwarf. Or, more accurately, every freaking dwarf in a role-playing setting, campaign or setting should not be a Scottish dwarf. I understand why this is, because, I mean, fucking Peter Jackson, man. Every dwarf is Scottish in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. I kind of get the feeling they were in J.R.R. Tolkien's anyway, but that's kind of besides the point. I have a real problem with this stereotyping of fantasy characters. It's like the whole thing of every barbarian is Gerbar, I will crush with hammer, whack. Kind of pisses me off because that's not how societies work. Where did this come from? I was looking back over notes from an old campaign I ran, and it had, I fuck you not, a Scottish dwarf, an effete English elf, and it had a troll that spoke in monosyllables. It was literally a walking, talking, ball scratching stereotype circus. It was ridiculous. And as I said, I understand why it happened and why players chose to play those characters. They're easy, but that's actually my problem with it. As much as Tolkien, to a degree, created the modern fantasy setting, or at least the traditional fantasy setting, he kind of created some railway tracks that a lot of people have problems breaking away from, especially in role-playing. And GMs are just as guilty of this as players are. They really are. And it comes down to a combination of things, not least of which are lazy writing and lazy role-playing. It's easy to write a Scottish dwarf. They're angry, they drink a lot. They like gold. It's easy to write a stereotypical elf. They speak with some kind of English accent. They're very educated. They're kind of airy and mystical. They're easy to write and they're easy to roleplay. But they're not particularly interesting. We've seen them 100 million frickin' times at this stage. And it's not necessary. And it's not necessary, and it shouldn't be encouraged because it kills character variation. I want to play in a role-playing campaign where you have a gnome who is... Give me a Scottish gnome who, for all intents and purposes, is an extra tiny dwarf. But then give me a dwarf who is, a city liver, who is urbane, who writes poetry, and I don't mean epic sagas, I mean like love poems, who doesn't use a battle axe, who uses words, whose main skill in the game is diplomacy. By the way, I once played a character whose primary combat type was the diplomacy skill. It was really fucking interesting. Didn't survive very long, but it was interesting. So it kills character variation and character variety, and it's not necessary. And actually, there are some great examples in geek culture of why you don't need to do it. Let's look at Dragon Age Inquisition. In Dragon Age Inquisition, you have Varix, who is an urbane, educated dwarf. He doesn't speak with a Scottish accent. Yeah, he likes to get drunk. But he writes romance novels. And he uses a crossbow, a four-limbed crossbow. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Emilia? Bianca. It was named Bianca. On the other side of the fence, then, we have Sarah, who is a gutter snipe elf. She's not particularly educated. Actually, she's incredibly rough and ready. She's abrasive. Hey, Winter. Rather unpleasant. And, what? Who are you talking to? There's no one else here. What the fuck? I'm out of here. This is disturbing. Anyway, she's a gutter snipe, and she's actually based on the kind of the stereotype of the Victorian gutter snipe. But an elf character who's like that is really interesting and different. And she's an excellent contrast to, and I cannot think of his name, but he's the other elf in the party. And he is educated and refined and the whole lot. Obviously, you find out there's a good reason for that, but I'm not going to spoil that. One of the most powerful warriors in the game is Cassandra, who is female and very pleasantly female at that. There's a reason I got it on PC, because as soon as I have a computer that can handle mods, yeah, bisexual Cassandra. I know that the cutscenes won't match up properly, but I don't care. It's Cassandra. I mean, so Dragon Age Inquisition is a great example of writers and setting creators bucking the trend. It's nice and it works. And yes, I know the dwarfs in Dragon Age Origins were different, but there's no reason why, even in a world where all dwarfs are Scottish madmen, alcoholic Scottish madmen at that, add another stereotype, why don't you? There is that one dwarf who isn't, and is the most interesting dwarf in the game because of that, or in the story, or whatever. Entirely other side of geekdom, you have Star Trek. Star Trek The Final Frontier, which honestly isn't as bad as people make it out to be. I'm not saying it's good. Anything that makes The Search for Spock look good is not good, but it's not that bad. I mean, it's a Star Trek episode stretched out. It's actually a pretty decent Star Trek episode stretched out to movie length. Plus it has catgirls. What's not to like? But it has a character named Sybok, who is the half-brother of Spock. Damn, Spock's daddy got around. Anyway, he's an atypical Vulcan. He embraces his emotions. He expresses them. He revels in them. He uses his telepathy and empathy in ways that are morally and ethically grey. Let's put it that way. But he's interesting, and he creates such a wonderful contrast between Spock, Sarek, two very typical Vulcans. I mean, even though Spock is a half Vulcan, he's more typical. He's the basis of most Vulcan characters in Star Trek to date. On the other hand, there's such a good contrast to Sybok that the atypical Vulcan makes that movie far more interesting than it could have been otherwise. At least for me. I'm trying to think what else do I have to say about this, because I can't really think of much else other than, if you want to make your GM really fucking happy, like really happy, play your character in an atypical manner. You know, and I'm speaking about racial rather than class, because class is something I want to talk about the traditional classes in their own videos in the future. But from a race point of view, gnomes don't have to be tinkerers. You could have a barbarian gnome who is, I hit him on the head with a hammer. He doesn't die, but I hit him on the head with a hammer. You know, gnomes could be that. You could have a cave troll who's a voracious reader. It's not likely, but if your GM is decent, he'll come up with some kind of house rule on the fly that will allow that character to exist. Maybe you have a Minotaur who's scared of mazes or mice. You have, have a character who goes against, not exactly against his race, but is swimming in a different stream parallel to it. There are certain things that each member of each race will be because it's the nature of those races. But don't mistake racial requirements for cultural requirements. I mean, there's lots of people who rebel against their culture. They're the people we consider to be trendsetters. They're often the people who become heroes in the future. And it's much more interesting to have characters like that. Now, obviously, if every character in the game is doing that, it could become somewhat chaotic. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. At least your campaign will go in some very interesting directions. So that is my opinion. No Scottish dwarfs. Also, no capes. Anyway, have a great day. Be good. Bye for now.